There comes a moment in every fight fan's life when they stop and ask themselves, what happens when there's no one left to beat? What happens when the king of the division stares across the cage, not at a bitter rival, not at a trash-talking challenger, but at someone who has been by his side every step of the way? You clicked on this video to get answers, and I promise you by the time this is over, you'll see the heavyweight division in a way you never have before. Because what's coming is bigger than a belt, bigger than a title unification. It's about the one thing fighters fear more than defeat. If you've been following the chaos unfolding in the heavyweight division, you know that Tom Aspinall has been on a mission. Ever since he won the interim title, he's had one name on his mind: Jon Jones. The greatest fighter to ever step into the octagon. The undefeated, seemingly untouchable legend who has spent over a decade dismantling every opponent put in front of him. And now, with Alex Pereira suffering a devastating loss to Magomed Ankalaev, Jones has no excuse left. The fight is closer than ever. Aspinall wants it. The UFC wants it. The fans want it. But here's the thing, no one is talking about what happens after. Because if you think the biggest fight of Tom Aspinall's life is against Jon Jones, you're wrong. The real challenge is something else entirely. Something that every fighter dreads, but none can escape. For years, Aspinall has trained alongside Mick Parkin, a fellow British heavyweight who up until now has been nothing but an ally. But here's where things get interesting. Parkin isn't just another sparring partner. He's undefeated. He's climbing the ranks. And if he keeps winning, there's no stopping the inevitable one day. The two of them will have to fight. But before we get there, let's talk about Parkin's current path. He's about to take on Marcin Tybura, a seasoned veteran, in what will be the toughest test of his career. A win there? That changes everything. Because that's when people start asking the uncomfortable questions. That's when the whispers start. How long before Parkin becomes a real contender? How long before he and Aspinall are no longer training partners, but opponents? And don't think for a second that Parkin hasn't already thought about it. In a rare, brutally honest moment, he admitted that the idea has been brought up. That Aspinall himself jokes about it, saying 2 more wins, mate, and we'll be in there. But behind the laughter, there's a reality that neither of them can ignore. If Parkin keeps winning, the UFC will come knocking. And when that day comes, they'll have a choice: step into the octagon as friends or as enemies. But there's something else. Something that could change everything. Parkin made one thing clear: he wouldn't fight Aspinall unless the money was life-changing. Unless it was for crazy money, I probably wouldn't be fighting Tom. And that's where this gets even more complicated. Because the UFC loves a good story. And there's no better story than teammates being forced to face off. We've seen it before. Friends turned into rivals because the sport demands it. Kamaru Usman vs. Gilbert Burns. Daniel Cormier vs. Cain Velasquez, a fight that never happened but loomed over their friendship for years. And now, the UFC might just be setting up the next chapter in that book. But before that day comes, there's still one fight that matters more than any other. Aspinall vs. Jon Jones. And if you ask Parkin, that fight won't just be the biggest in UFC history. It'll be the moment Jon Jones finally tastes defeat. Think about that for a second. Jon Jones has never been beaten. Not really. Sure, there's that one loss on his record, a disqualification for illegal elbows, but no one has ever truly beaten him. No one has ever been able to say, I was better than Jon Jones. And yet, Mick Parkin believes Tom Aspinall will be the first. Why? It's not just about skill. It's not just about size. It's about timing. Fighters don't stay on top forever. And as Parkin pointed out, Jon Jones is not the same fighter he was 5 years ago. Maybe not even the same fighter he was 2 years ago. He's older. He's been injured. And if there was ever a time to beat him, it's now. Because while Jones has been on the sidelines, Aspinall has been getting better. Faster. Sharper. More dangerous. He moves like no heavyweight we've ever seen before. He has the speed of a middleweight, the power of a heavyweight, and the hunger of a man who knows his time is now. So let's say it happens. Let's say Aspinall shocks the world and beats Jon Jones. What then? Does Jones retire? Does Aspinall become the undisputed king? And if he does, what happens when Mick Parkin is next in line? Because here's the truth. Fighters don't get to choose their destiny. The moment Parkin is the rightful contender, the moment the UFC decides that the fight has to happen, it won't matter if they're friends. It won't matter how much they respect each other. The sport will demand it. And that's the part no one is ready for. Because when you train with someone, when you've bled with them, struggled with them, celebrated victories and endured losses together, fighting them isn't just another fight. It's personal. Even when you try to tell yourself it's not. So the real question is, when that day comes, will it be business as usual? Or will it be something else entirely? This is the kind of story that doesn't just disappear. It's the kind that builds, slowly, piece by piece, until it finally explodes in a way no one sees coming. And if you think we've reached the climax, trust me, we're just getting started. Because the future of the heavyweight division is being written right now. And no matter how much they try to avoid it, no matter how much they laugh it off or push it to the side, Tom Aspinall and Mick Parkin are on a collision course. And the only question left is who will blink first. If you've made it this far, you already know we're far from done. Are you ready for the next part? Because trust me, things are about to get even more intense. Let me know, and we'll dive even deeper. Imagine this. The octagon is set. The lights are dimmed except for the single beam illuminating the battleground, and the crowd roars with a mixture of anticipation and disbelief. Two men step forward, not enemies, not rivals born from animosity, but two warriors who have walked the same path, pushed each other to the brink in training, and now stand on opposite sides of the cage with one simple truth between them: only one can leave as champion. This isn't just any fight. This isn't just about gold. This is the moment when everything changes. And you, watching from the edge of your seat, have to ask yourself, how did we get here? How did two men who once stood side by side as allies, sparring, learning, evolving together, end up in the most brutal and unforgiving place in combat sports? You clicked on this video to get the truth, and trust me, you're going to get the answer you came for. But by the time we're done, you might find yourself questioning everything you thought you knew about fighting, loyalty, and what it truly means to be a champion. Let's rewind. Let's go back to where this all started before Tom Aspinall and Mick Parkin were potential opponents. Before the UFC even considered the possibility of the two of them clashing for the heavyweight throne. Because before any of this was even a whisper in the air, the focus was on one man, Jon Jones. Jones, the undefeated legend, the greatest of all time, had loomed over the division like a shadow. His dominance was unquestioned. His resume was filled with the biggest names in MMA history, fighters who all had one thing in common. They couldn't figure out how to beat him. And now, for the first time in his career, the whispers of doubt were starting to creep in. Was he still the same fighter? Was time finally catching up to him? And if so, was Tom Aspinall the one to finally do what no one else had done? Mick Parkin believed so. Even as he prepared for his own battle against Markin Tybura, even as he mapped out his own journey up the rankings, he had no doubt in his mind Aspinall was the man to dethrone Jon Jones. And then it happened. On the biggest night in UFC heavyweight history, Tom Aspinall walked into the octagon with the weight of an entire division on his shoulders. Across from him stood the legend, the man who had never truly tasted defeat. And for 5 brutal, grueling rounds, the two men waged war. Blood was spilled, bones cracked under the force of monstrous blows, and for the first time in his career, Jon Jones looked mortal. The moment the final bell rang, there was no doubt. The new era had arrived. Tom Aspinall had done the impossible. He was the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world. And that's when the real problem started. Because while the world celebrated, while fans flooded social media with praise and disbelief, while the headlines called it the greatest heavyweight fight of all time, one man sat back and watched with quiet understanding. Mick Parkin. He had won his fight against Tybura. He had climbed one step higher. And now, with the division reshuffling, with contenders being chosen carefully, with Aspinall now wearing the undisputed crown, the inevitable question was asked once again: what happens when Mick Parkin reaches the top? The first time, it was just a joke. Just 2 training partners messing around in the gym. 2 more wins, mate, and we'll be in there. But now it wasn't a joke. Now it was a reality neither of them could escape. The UFC saw the story unfolding before their eyes. The fans, hungry for drama, for unpredictability, started fueling the conversation. Would they fight? Could they fight? And if they did, what would it look like? Parkin tried to dismiss it. "He is my friend," he had said. "He's helped me out loads in my career." But loyalty only goes so far in this sport. Fighters don't get to choose their destiny. The moment Parkin became the rightful contender, the moment he had cleared out the rest of the competition, the UFC made it clear this fight had to happen. And so, the contract was sent. The offer was on the table. The biggest all-British heavyweight fight in UFC history. A fight that could sell out Wembley Stadium. A fight that could make them both millionaires overnight. And for the first time, there was hesitation. Because fighting an enemy, that's easy. Fighting a stranger, a man you have no emotional connection to, that's business. But fighting someone who has been with you through every step of your career, fighting someone who knows your strengths, your weaknesses, your fears, that's something else entirely. Parkin had said before that he wouldn't fight Aspinall unless the money was crazy. But the UFC knew how to play their cards. They dangled the biggest payday either man had ever seen. Enough to change their lives forever. Enough to make them rethink everything. And so, after weeks of negotiations, after countless sleepless nights, after the entire MMA world held its breath, the answer finally came. Tom Aspinall. Mick Parkin. For the undisputed UFC Heavyweight Championship. And just like that, 2 men who had once trained together, laughed together, built each other up, now stood on opposite sides of the cage, knowing that in a matter of minutes, they would be throwing everything they had at each other. The crowd was electric. The tension was unlike anything the sport had seen before. And as the referee stepped forward, as he looked each man in the eye, as he asked them if they were ready, there was a moment, a brief, fleeting second where both Aspinall and Parkin locked eyes and understood exactly what was about to happen. Because this wasn't just about the title anymore. This was about proving who was truly the best. The bell rang, and the war began. Now, you might think you know how this story ends. But trust me, you have no idea. Because what happened in that cage that night? What unfolded between Tom Aspinall and Mick Parkin? It wasn't just another fight. It was something the UFC had never seen before. Something that changed the course of the heavyweight division forever. And if you want to know what happened next, all you have to do is let me know. Because the final chapter, it's a story you'll never forget. The air inside the sold-out arena was suffocating with tension. The world had never seen a fight quite like this before. Two warriors bound by respect, training, and a shared journey now forced to stand across from each other with only one truth between them. One would leave with gold wrapped around their waist, and the other would leave with nothing. The referee's voice cut through the deafening noise of the crowd. "Fighters, are you ready?" Tom Aspinall gave a small nod, his jaw clenched, his breath steady. Mick Parkin did the same, his hands loose but his body vibrating with anticipation. Then, without another word, the bell rang. What happened next would be etched into the sport's history forever. Both men exploded from their corners with an intensity that sent the crowd into a frenzy. There was no feeling-out process, no testing the waters. These two had spent years sparring together, had broken each other down in training over and over again. There were no secrets here. No tricks to be discovered. This wasn't about learning, it was about executing. Aspinall fired first, launching a lightning-fast jab that snapped Parkin's head back. The interim champion's speed was still his greatest weapon, even against someone who had trained to handle it. Parkin, knowing this, didn't hesitate to respond. A massive right hand came screaming toward Aspinall's chin. He barely ducked in time, the wind of the strike grazing his ear. The pace was shocking for heavyweights. This wasn't a slow, methodical battle. It was a sprint. A war waged with technique and ferocity in equal measure. Aspinall's footwork was dazzling, constantly moving, constantly setting angles that forced Parkin to adjust. But Parkin refused to let himself be picked apart. He cut off the cage masterfully, forcing Aspinall toward the fence. And then, in a moment that made the entire arena gasp, Parkin uncorked a left hook that landed flush. Aspinall stumbled. His legs wobbled for the briefest of moments. And that was all Parkin needed. He charged forward, launching another right hand, one that, had it landed clean, could have ended the fight. But Aspinall wasn't a champion by luck. He wasn't just another contender. He had made it to the top for a reason. Instinct took over. Aspinall ducked under the punch, his world spinning in slow motion, and in the blink of an eye, he shot forward, wrapping his arms around Parkin's waist. The crowd exploded. A takedown attempt. This was the part of Aspinall's game that had always been overlooked. People marveled at his striking, at his speed, at his ability to finish fights in devastating fashion. But they forgot that he was a true mixed martial artist. They forgot that he could wrestle. And as Parkin tried to stuff the takedown, as he dug his feet into the canvas, Aspinall shifted his weight, changing direction in an instant. Parkin was lifted off his feet. And then he was slammed onto the mat. The impact was brutal. Parkin gritted his teeth, his arms immediately coming up to defend. But Aspinall was relentless. He passed to half guard instantly, raining down short elbows that forced Parkin to turn. The round was slipping away. Parkin tried to scramble. He tried to explode upward to force a reset on the feet where he knew he had the best chance. But Aspinall was a step ahead. He transitioned, locking in a vice-like grip around Parkin's neck. The arena held its breath. The rear naked choke was in. Parkin's hands instinctively shot up, trying to peel Aspinall's grip away. His body twisted, his feet kicked against the mat. His mind was screaming for oxygen. And then before he could decide if he should fight until the very last second or risk going unconscious, his hand tapped. The referee dove in. It was over. Aspinall released the hold immediately, rolling away as Parkin collapsed onto the canvas, gasping for air. For a brief moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, the crowd erupted. The camera zoomed in on Parkin, his head down, his chest heaving. Defeat had never felt like this before. Losing to Tom Aspinall was something he had never even considered possible. But before the weight of the loss could settle into his bones, something else happened. Aspinall, still on his knees, reached forward, his hand extended. And without hesitation, Parkin took it. The two men, former training partners, now battle-worn warriors, embraced in the center of the octagon. There was no animosity, no bitterness, only respect. As the official decision was read, as the belt was wrapped around Aspinall's waist, as the world finally processed what they had just witnessed, one thing became clear. This wasn't just another title fight. This was the moment that defined an era. And as the dust settled, as both men left the cage that night, there was one question lingering in everyone's mind: what happens next? Because if you think this was the end of the story, if you think this was the final chapter, you haven't been paying attention. The world of MMA never stops moving. And the next challenge, the next war, it was already waiting.